Hey everyone, welcome to part two of four on the Deadliest American Hoax. And so I'm going to go ahead and use this PowerPoint to keep me on track. And we'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. All right. So in this part of the Deadliest American Hoax, I'm going to be going over the making of the revolutionary right there, Dr. Bernard Nathanson. And just as a quick reminder, the commission from him to me on December 1st, 2009 was to teach the strategy of how he deceived America and then deliver his parting message across the nation, which is what we're going to be doing in this four-part series. I think it's important to know that America's abortion king grew up in a loveless home. He grew up in a Jewish home, but it was a loveless home. His father was Jewish, but he had not a seedling of faith. And his father made sure to young Bernard that young Bernard would not have a seedling of faith either. And in fact, yeah, it was very, very hurtful to young Bernard to see how his father would verbally denigrate the mother until she was pretty much a basket case. And then Bernard had a sister who eventually committed suicide as a young adult. And he attributes just this crazy home life that they grew up in. Bernard's father was a general practitioner who also practiced like OBGYN because way back then you didn't have all the specialty areas of medicine. And so he had the pressure from his father, to grow up to become a doctor. And so young Bernard does go off to college. His father sort of arranges for young Bernard to be accepted into a certain university because his father knew the president and there was lots of pressure there. Maybe his father had been a contributor, I'm not quite sure, to the college, but it took a little arm wrestling his father with the president. But anyway, so Bernard was accepted in, and during college, he falls in love with this girl named Ruth. But Ruth becomes with child because of Bernard Nathanson. And of course, Nathanson's like freaking out because I think at that point he was in med school and he, he couldn't fathom, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Get married and have a baby and also get through med school or whatever. And so this was his first step into the satanic world of abortion. And he reaches out to his father for the money, and his father provides the funding. And Bernard sort of coerces his girlfriend to have an abortion, which is done in Canada. And she almost dies on the operating table from excessive bleeding. And sadly, that ultimately broke up their relationship. And that was the beginning. Okay, so from childhood to that first abortion during what I do believe was med school. And and by the way, he looked back on that because he deeply, at least he thought he did, deeply loved this young woman named Ruth. And really, all of his life, he often wondered, later on after he had his pro-life conversion, he often wondered how life would have been so different if he had married Ruth and she had had their child. All right, so by now it's the 1950s. Bernard Nathanson is an OBGYN, and he had seen the theater of abortion during med school. So I'm going to digress a little bit. He had seen doctors making deals. It could be, say, the general practitioner um, referring a pregnant woman to the doctor who's to the OBGYN, okay? But there'd be some cash payment. Well, she would be feigning having a miscarriage to the secretary at the front desk of the OBGYN office. She would even be counseled, from the doctor to bring in a something that appears to be blood, so she could pretend that she's having a miscarriage. And so, so So there would be exchange of funds in the men's bathroom. Dr. Nathanson said he witnessed it numerous times. And so the doctor would be paid off for that referral to that illegal abortion to the OBGYN who would pretend she's having a miscarriage, and then he would have to perform the D&C. All right, when in effect, it was actually just an abortion. So Nathanson thought this is so wrong. And why is it only women with some money can have these, fake miscarriages, and women who don't have any funds, they're trying to perform, illegal self-induced abortion. He did not see thousands of women doing this, but he did see a number of women coming into, when he was in residency, coming into the operating room, and sick, with sepsis, all sorts of damage. So, okay, so that was during residency, and now he's a doctor, and now he gets another girlfriend pregnant, but this time he performs the abortion himself. And so now he's got two strikes against him. But back then he thought, got that thing done in 30 minutes or less. He was very proud of himself, and there was not one thought that he just killed his own child. So those are the beginning years. So then in the 1960s, we're having the sexual revolution, and a man by the name of Lawrence Lader reaches out to Dr. Nathanson. Interestingly, Lawrence Lader was Jewish as well. I do not know if he was an atheist. If I was a betting woman, I would bet he was. But Lawrence Lader had been a very, very dear friend. In fact, it's suspected possibly a lover to Margaret Sanger, the founder of what we know as Planned Parenthood. And she died in 1966, but it was as if she had passed her baton over to Lawrence Lader, saying, "You take it from here and get population under control and make sure we're advancing eugenics while we promote, the world of promiscuity." Okay, that's Lawrence Lader, and he wrote the only approved biography of Margaret Sanger. So Lawrence calls Dr. Nathanson, they both lived in New York City, and invites Nathanson and his wife over for dinner. And it was over at that dinner that Lawrence later declares abortion needs to be legalized in all 50 states. I think at that time about it was legal in about 12 different states, but Lawrence later was on a mission to get it normalized all across the nation. And Dr. Nathanson thought that too. But I have to say, Nathanson would never have been able to become the medical face of the abortion movement had it not been for the architect, Lawrence Lader. All right, so between the two of them, this duo, and later was quite savvy. He knew he needed to have a doctor in a white coat. So just remember it this way. Dr. Nathanson was the Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci of yesteryear, the man in front of the media with a white lab coat on, spewing lie after lie after lie to change public opinion. The other thing to know about Lawrence Lader is he had worked for the first card-carrying communist on Capitol Hill. So the radical idea of, the abortion revolution, that was nothing new for this man. He had been part of radicalized, communism, Marxism for years. And so they partner up because Lawrence later knows, as the architect, that they have to change public opinion so that they can have a political victory. Okay. And he knew he'd have to have a doctor in a white lab coat, and particularly a male doctor. So a male in a position of authority. So nothing better than a man in a white lab coat with MD behind his name. But they also needed somebody else. They needed a woman, and that would be Betty Friedan. Betty, from the reading I've done, she was another Jewish woman. I do not know if the woman had any faith at all, but it looks like she was also a Marxist communist. And Betty became the co-founder of the National Organization for Women. And at first, when they had their first NOW, um, um, their big convention, their first one with all these women, abortion, legalizing abortion was no part of the platform. But Lawrence later spent the next year working on Betty Friedan's mind, psyching her up with the belief, the same thing that Margaret Sanger had, that you don't control your life if you don't have control over your body and your reproductive system. Okay, so Betty joined on to this first pro-abortion political action organization known as the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. Then they shortened it years later to NARAL, 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 oh gosh, I'm totally blanking. NARAL Pro-Choice America. There you go. Um, so the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws um, to the Pro-Abortion Action Committee, NARAL. Um, let's see. So today it's known as NARAL Pro-Choice America, and they've also adopted another name to welcome in all the transgender, so men, can have babies. That's now part of the plank of NARAL. So anyway, that's a little bit about the past. And so I think it's important to know that when they set out to push legalized abortion all over America, how little doctors and scientists knew about the baby in the womb. So by the time they were funded and ready to hit the national scene, it was 1969. And Dr. Nathanson wrote about this in one of his books called The Hand of God. So the question is, how many articles on the topic of fetal anatomy and physiology were there in the 1969 cumulative Medicus Index? So this is an accumulation of all articles, not just 1969, but all articles that had ever been written about fetal anatomy and physiology. So guess how many, everybody? I wish I could hear you. Okay. There were only 5. Research scientists and the doctors, they didn't know anything about the baby in the womb when, as far as I'm concerned, the devil had his victory with the Supreme Court and with NARAL. So they launched the pro-abortion movement when nothing was known about the baby in the womb. Okay. And then so life begins. And actually, before I go over here, I'd like to also share this, that the other thing they didn't know was, well, over the years, since 1935, still very little was known, obviously, 1935. And about 750 women who had given birth would die per 100,000 live births way back in the mid 1930s. So 750 women would die per 100,000 live births. Just a few short years later, in the 1940s, with better advances of C-sections, medications, antibiotics, fetal heart monitoring, and other, fetal care, um, it went from 750 down to around 350 women would die per 100,000 live births. But by the time NARAL began its pro-abortion campaign, there were only about 35 women dying per year due to complications of live birth per 100,000 babies born live. And so that's a huge drop. And then the other thing is, way back in the 1930s, there used to be almost in every county a committee of doctors and nurses to help with fetal care. When the women were still with child, to educate the women about nutrition and whatever else they would do. Well, by the 1969, most of those committees were gone. They were defunct because very few women were dying. So anytime you ever hear, a politician or a candidate saying, well, we can't go back to yesteryear, pre Roe v. Wade, when so many women were dying, even in childbirth, it's no excuse, okay, because it was almost unheard of. Okay, so that's the beginning of that. And then Nathanson, he was an OBGYN, he was an abortionist who ran the largest abortion mill in New York City, where they were aborting about 800 to 900 babies per 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 week, 800 to 900 per week. And he was running this, large abortion facility in New York City. And then by the end of 1972, he was exhausted and he decided to quit the abortion mill and go become chief of obstetrics at St. Luke's Hospital in New York City. Now, don't let the name of the hospital fool you. St. Luke's, sadly, they were aborting babies on one floor and birthing babies on another floor. And Dr. Nathanson told me, and I think he wrote about this as well, but I know he told me, he said sometimes he would arrive and he would be confused because it might be a woman going into, premature labor, let's just say at whatever X number of weeks, say 20 weeks or something. And he couldn't remember, when was he there to save the life of that 20-year-old baby, or was he there to kill it? So it's this real whipsaw, okay? And again, Dr. Nathanson had said he had not a seedling of faith, okay? So that was the year 1973. In January 1973, we get the Roe v. Wade decision. So now abortion's legal in all 50 states. And then when you pair that up with the Doe versus Bolton, which basically the court ruled on about the same time, when you put those two together, a woman can abort her baby through all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason whatsoever. You know, 9 months, baby coming down the birth canal. I have a headache and I really don't feel like having this baby. I don't want a baby. That baby was not protected all those years. And sadly, there's in many states now, since Roe's been overturned, in many states, the state laws now have gone so radical. So what changed Dr. Nathanson's mind? Now, it was 1973, and about 6 months or so after the Roe v. Wade decision, the hospital rolls in a brand new technology called real-time ultrasound. And Dr. Nathanson begins using that ultrasound. And I know you've already read it. He said real-time ultrasound was the bomb. It made everything come alive. This is his quote to me when I interviewed him. And Dr. Nathanson said he couldn't argue with the science. The science, he had to be intellectually honest with himself. The science revealed the humanity of the baby in the womb. And Dr. Nathanson could tell he was bonding with his second patient. He has one patient, the mother, but then he's bonding with the baby in the womb. He could see the baby yawning and stretching and sucking his or her thumb. And just for clarity, I'm using here a 4D ultrasound video, which is, so much more clearer than the 3D ultrasound of yesteryear back in the 1970s. Back then it was much more grainy, but this is what people can see today. And this is a real video. This had, I think, millions of views. But this is what changed the father of the abortion industry's mind. He could no longer deny the humanity of the baby in the womb. And he recognized very quickly abortion is a form of murder. Okay. And so it's 1973. So all of 73 goes by, all of 1974. So now we're 2 years. It's 2 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. And Dr. Nathanson had spent 2 years trying to change the mind of the board of directors of NARAL, letting NARAL know that the science has caught up with their lies, science had caught up with their propaganda, and that he had followed the science and it led him to this position. And the position is that he needed to resign from NARAL. Okay. Now, for the sake of the brevity of this video, you can read a longer excerpt. Actually, no, tell you what, I'm going to read the excerpt, the full excerpt from his resignation letter. It's where I got the name of my book, What If We've Been Wrong? But he writes the letter on the second anniversary of Roe v. Wade to Lawrence later, January 22nd, 1975. The judgments of the Supreme Court were never meant to be infallible or eternal. And what if we've been wrong? If the court should soon reverse itself in light of changing times and or new scientific evidence, what an incalculable injustice will have been perpetrated. What an immeasurable, irretrievable loss will have been suffered. And I can no longer afford the $10 a year dues, uh, nor the hubris of certainty. And he submitted his resignation letter. All right. So this is what Americans need to learn. And this wraps up part 2 of 4 of the Deadliest American Hoax. And I hope that you, before you just run and move on with life, if you would maybe lift this up in prayer, if you're a praying person, that every single American will one day know the truth that Dr. Nathanson left behind. So this next part, I'm going to carry you through the 1980s, the suicidal thoughts, and his baptism. So I'll see you on part 3 of 4 of the Deadliest American Hoax.